Oh, thanks very much, Jody. Good morning, everybody. Greetings from, well, not very sunny Liverpool this morning. My name's Colin Foley, and I'm the training director for the ADHD Foundation, the Neurodiversity Charity. And it's my absolute pleasure to deliver this presentation for you here this morning on ADHD and masking. If this is the first time that you've ever engaged in one of these sessions run by the Witherslack group, can I welcome you and can I thank everybody for giving up an hour of their precious busy lives to engage with this session this morning. But if this is the first time that you've ever engaged with this, can I just say that we've been working in partnership with the Witherslack group for a number of years now, and it's a very important partnership for us at the ADHD Foundation. The Witherslack group is an organisation that we greatly admire and respect for the work that they do with neurodiverse children and young people. If I inspire any of you this morning and you would like to find out more about us and what we do and the services that we offer, then there's our email address on the slide there if you want to have a look at our website for more information around what the ADHD Foundation Neurodiversity Charity is. So, are we up for this, everyone? I'm going to talk for about 45 minutes, and then we've got an opportunity for Q&A. So if you can please put any questions or comments as we're going along in the chat, and Jody is going to have a look at them and pass them on to me for the final kind of 10, 15 minutes. So we've got 45 minutes to talk about masking, which is a massive subject. So hold on to your hats, everyone. And it's been something that I've been talking about and thinking about a lot over the last kind of 5 to 10 years in relation to neurodiversity. But I'll just say this before we start. The whole discussion around masking and our understanding and awareness of masking started with an exploration of autistic girls and young women, and then it broadened out to include all neurodiverse conditions. So we're talking about ADHD here this morning. But let's not forget that there's a lot of reasons why a child or a young person may mask things in their lives. So when we're having this discussion around masking with ADHD this morning, let's think about those children and young people who might be masking other things. For example, mental health challenges, depression, high levels of anxiety, sexuality, gender identity, difficulties and problems that they're having in their lives in terms of things like bullying or some issues that are going on at home, of course. So the masking, the conversation around masking really needs to develop to talk about a myriad of reasons why a child or a young person may mask. The conversation around masking has been predominantly about girls and young women. One of the things that I'm interested in is how do boys mask? Do boys mask? I had this conversation with a group of educational professionals yesterday in Wales, and a man said, you know, girls mask and boys don't. And then the room kind of erupted, and there was a really good discussion then around, well, of course, boys mask, but what does that look like? Is it the same as girls or is it different? So that's something that I think that we really need to develop the discussion around as well. But if you want to go right back to the beginning, everybody, and talk about what is masking. So masking then, as I mentioned before, what is masking? It's a series of behaviours or presentations where children, young people, or indeed adults will try to hide, camouflage, suppress, minimise the features of, in this case, a neurodiverse condition like ADHD. And there's a whole number of reasons why somebody might do this as a child or a young person. And one of them, of course, is not to stand out, not to draw attention to yourself. One of the features, for example, of anxiety is that children or young people who feel highly anxious will deliberately try to push people away who are trying to help them, sorry. And in this case, masking is similar to that in the sense of if I hide and suppress some of the challenges that I might be having, say, for example, in this classroom, then, you know, I don't draw the attention of the teacher or the other adult educational professional in in the room, and therefore they're not going to come and try to help me because I don't look like I need any help, and therefore I don't bring attention to myself, of course. And this is very, very important when we understand adolescence. Those of you that have got teenagers at home, one of the principal features of adolescence, and we all went through it, if you can remember what you were like through your adolescence, one of the principal features is a significantly increased self-consciousness about yourself. You know, for the first time in your life as a teenager, you become truly aware of what others might think of you or how you might be perceived by others, and finding your tribe and bonding with them and fitting in and all those things can become really, really important. And if you stand out in any way, right, because of the features of a neurodiverse condition, then the pressure on certain teenagers to act a certain way to fit in with a certain group then can lead to some children or young people feeling the need to mask certain features of their neurodiversity. Now, there is some research around masking, of course. It needs to go a lot further because there's a discussion around the subject of masking, which is at what point does it become unconscious with some people? I'll give you an example of this. My sister is in her mid-60s. My brother and I have been talking to her for many years about autism. It's only been in the last kind of few years that she's kind of begun to kind of talk about maybe the fact that she's autistic herself. And she said to me recently, she said to me, you know, when you go out socially, Colin, you know, do you think about who is going to be there when you go out? And do you think about what they might say to you? And do you plan what you are going to say back? And I said, no. I said, so she said, you just go out and whatever happens, happens. And I said, yeah, pretty much. Right. And she had masked those feelings for so long and masked that behaviors that she did that was linked to her autism, that she got to the point where she kind of thought everybody did this. And so it can get to the point if a person has masked for such a period of time that actually it becomes a bit unconscious. It's just something that you do, automatically, almost without really considering it. Russell Barkley, who is one of the world's leading experts on ADHD, he talked about masking years ago, but he didn't use that term. He used the term impression management. So you're trying to manage the way that your impression upon other people. Some research would suggest that as high as a third of people with ADHD mask. I'm a little bit dubious about this research because I think that it's difficult to quantify things like masking. I think people with ADHD may mask in different settings and in different environments, depending on how they are and how they're feeling and what they're doing and who's there. And so I think it's difficult to say that, well, a percentage of people do and a percentage of people don't. I think it's much more complex than this. I delivered a series of training sessions last year for the Youth Sports Trust in Loughborough in the Midlands, and I co-delivered these sessions with an autistic woman who worked for the trust. And she was just, the way she talked about her autism, I just thought was fantastic. And she said to me, or she said to the group, my autism is a circle. And I move around that circle, depending on what I'm doing that day. So I may have issues with social communication, one of the features of autism, depending on who I'm with, how I'm feeling, what the level of demand is upon me in that moment. And then the next day, I might have none of those issues. And I think the same has to go for masking as well, doesn't it? With any of the neurodiverse conditions, the pressure on somebody to mask, right, depends on the environment, who they're with, how they're feeling, the level of demand that is on them. We see this particularly, don't we, with the number of children who go to school and mask and then go home And then the presentation of that child at home is very different from school. And the parents are ringing up the school. I'm sure some of you have been in this position, saying she's banging her head against the wall when she comes home from school. And the school says, well, she's been an absolute delight. We're not seeing any of this. This need to, masking as very much very specific and very linked to the environment that somebody is in and the pressures that are on them in that moment. And I mentioned already that the last point on that slide, that we need to really do a lot more around boys masking and a discussion around masking. And when I go into schools, and I go into schools all the time and deliver training, and say to the school, let's talk about masking. Have you as a staff team just talked about masking in and of itself, how it might look, why a child might mask, what to look out for in the children just generally? And I'm quite cheered, everyone, by especially the parents might like to hear this, that increasingly we're getting more and more schools who are running sessions for their staff, which is just about the concept of masking particularly. So why might somebody mask? Well, to avoid the stigma, if there is a stigma around having ADHD and standing out, and many children and young people, of course, do experience stigma in certain settings in their lives. I was talking to a woman yesterday who was an ALNCO, which is a Welsh Senko, and she was saying that, a lot of the sports clubs, local sports clubs for children in her area, don't really accept children with ADHD. They're quite elitist in their approach, and the children who go do experience some degree of stigma there. And she was trying to kind of counter this and argue against this. That attempt to fit in, to be like everybody else, not to stand out. I mentioned it before, particularly marked with adolescence, of course. So if your teenager is going through this, you can understand why it is. But another reason, and a really important reason, I believe, why somebody may choose to mask, especially if they've got ADHD or autism, is to do with what's called RSD, or rejection sensitivity. Now, rejection sensitivity, if you've not heard of this, are particular concerns and challenges around criticism, rejection, or failure. So if I don't mask, then I open myself up potentially to more criticism, rejection, or failure. Okay, and the reason why we associate this with ADHD and autism in particular, because if you think about it, everyone, none of us like criticism, don't we? We don't like being criticized. So I think anybody could be rejection sensitive in that sense. But the reason why we particularly talk about this in relation to ADHD and autism is to do with the early experience of the child when they were very young. I was reading a study from the States recently that said by the age of 12, a child with ADHD has received as much as 50 times more negative adult attention compared to a neurotypical child at the age of 12. So if you've grown up in your life and had received messages from a range of different people, but received messages like shut up, sit still, stop fidgeting, what have you lost now? What have you forgotten? Why are you weird? Why can't you play with the other children? If you've received those messages, it's no surprise, is it, that you might actually then go on to develop challenges around criticism, rejection, or failure. And masking can be a way in which children and young people try to counter this and avoid this by masking features of themselves. And you can see on the slide there, you can see some of the presentations of what's called RSD. You might be constantly looking for signs of criticism or rejection, have intense emotional responses to when it happens. If you look at the research around this, then there are two presentations of RSD. rejection sensitive dysphoria. One is what's called high anger RSD, and that's when people fight back. So if you criticize me, my brain is going to go into fight, stress response, and I'm going to argue back with you. Or we have what's called high anxiety RSD. Now think about this, everyone, in relation to masking. High anxiety RSD is when people shut up. So I'm not going to put my hand up in this class. I'm not going to go to the party at the weekend. I'm not going to join that group. I'm not going to volunteer anything in this meeting, for example, or in this group activity in a school, right? Because I'm not anxious that I'm going to expose myself and people are going to criticize me and I won't be able to manage that criticism. Okay. It can be very, very extreme, or people become people pleasers. So I'll agree with everything you say. I'll do whatever you want. Just don't ask me anything of myself. I'm going to try and mask all of that, right? Because I'm anxious that I'm going to be criticized. And this can be a reason why children and young people, particularly with ADHD, mask the features of their ADHD to avoid that rejection, avoid that stigma or criticism, particularly. Now, I know that we've run sessions specifically on RSD for the Witherslack group, and I don't want the whole session to be about RSD. So if you are interested in this, and if you're recognizing some of the things that I'm saying to you about your child or any of the children that you're working with, then can I recommend something to you? You can see it on the slide there. There is a brilliant online magazine from the States called ADHD Magazine. And it's if you get past the American language, then it's a really, really good resource, particularly around ADHD, for professionals, for parents and carers, and for teenagers. So put your teenager onto it if you think they'll engage with this. And they've done a lot of work on rejection sensitivity. You can see the website address there, www.attitude.com. They did a big piece of research a few years ago with thousands of adults and teenagers across America with ADHD. And they asked them, what is the most challenging part of having ADHD on a daily basis? And would you believe that 1 in 3 people came back and said it was rejection sensitivity? You can see on the slide there, 99% of teenagers, when they were asked, and adults, identify as being more sensitive when it comes to things like criticism and rejection. And this can be a real driving force around masking. Now, we need to recognize that if a child or a young person is highly rejection sensitive, they are highly anxious. And we'll talk about this in a few minutes in terms of supporting your child's levels of anxiety in general. But another strategy that we can use as adults working with children or young people or parents or carers is just to be a bit more conscious of our spoken language, the words and phrases that we are using with children or young people who are rejection sensitive, and neutralizing some of that language. So, when we is talking, especially to teenagers, talking to teenagers around when I talk to you and the way that I speak to you and the language that I use with you, what is it that you find quite difficult? What words, phrases do you find difficult to shrug off? Or what becomes distracting to you, so that if I tell you you're wrong and then tell you why, you're not listening to the why, because your brain has been flooded with the stress hormone, cortisol, just after I've said the word wrong, for example. So it's about neutralizing the way that we speak to people, and having that conversation in an age-appropriate way, of course, that conversation with children or young people around how they receive spoken language, and are they perceiving it as a criticism all the time? And if we change the way that we speak and neutralize it, they might not have that immediate perception that they are being criticized, and therefore don't then have to mask in order to avoid that. So let's talk about, everyone, let's talk about some of the ways in which masking can present. Now, when I go into schools, I'll say, don't think of masking as the child sat in the far corner of the classroom, behind the biggest device, not making eye contact with you as a teacher. It could be, but actually, masking could take a number of different forms. So masking could be a child who is constantly in your face, asking for a lot of reassurance all the time, checking out everything repeatedly. It could be children who are excessive worriers and articulate, consistently a sense of worry and anxiety around certain things. Interestingly, one of the features of masking, if you look at the bottom left, can be overcompensation. When I say this, everyone, I think about a former colleague of mine who was one of our trainers in the ADHD Foundation, and he had an ADHD diagnosis, and he talked about his masking throughout his life, and particularly in a professional context. And he said when he was a child, he used to come home from school every day and sit with his mum, and God bless this mother, and he would tell his mum everything that happened to him that day in school, or particularly what he learned that day in school. And his mum would write it all down for him. A real worry, but overcompensation about memory. And we know that many children and young people with ADHD struggle with memory, particularly working memory. Right? And he was overcompensating for this, and his mum was trying to support him in that. I met a woman recently who was diagnosed with ADHD in middle age, and she said to me that all her life, people in her life, friends, colleagues, family, had often said to her, you've got ADHD. And she said, I haven't got ADHD. She said, because I am really well organized. And she talked me through her weekly routine. And, and she sticks to this routine every week in terms of her job, her home, things like housework and cooking and laundry and all of this. And it was incredibly well organized. And so she said, that's not ADHD. So when she went to the doctor when she finally said, well, I'll look into it, and went to the doctor for her diagnosis, and the doctor said, you've overcompensated for years and years. You have put this really strict routine into your life to make sure that you are, managing some of the possible features of ADHD. He said, you've had ADHD all along. You've just been overcompensating for that fact, which I thought was just a really interesting story about it. But, for example, people who turn up very early, or people who do things, significantly in advance of when they've got to do it, so they can put it to one side and move on. But you can see there how there are a whole range of different presentations of masking. A colleague of mine who has ADHD, AUDHD, that's autism and ADHD together. When I was talking to her once about her school experience at school, she said to me, one of the most significant things that happened to me at school, she said, Colin, was that I got a part in a play. And she said, I learned in primary school, I learned that you could take a part, you could be somebody else. You could act like you were somebody else. And she said she realized at that age that actually that's what she did every day. She copied what the neurotypical girls were doing, right, in order to, mask the features of her ADHD. And that was quite interesting, that idea of copying what people say, copying how they operate. If I'm in a group, in a classroom, and I don't really know what's going on, but I'm not going to say that because I'm trying to mask it, and somebody else says something and the teacher says that's great, I might repackage that. I might say it in a different way or whatever, so it looks like I know what's going on, right? And I can keep this mask intact. For example, look in the middle point on that slide, everyone. Suppressing physical movements. I delivered a training session for a bank a couple of months ago in Manchester, And there was a woman there with ADHD on the course, and she said to me, she said, I can sum up my experience at school, she said, in one word. I said, what's the word? And she said, containment. She said, physically, it felt like I was being physically contained. She said, I would sit on my hands, she said, to try and stop my arms from moving. She said I would sometimes get cramp in my arms, or my arms and shoulders would be sore at the end of the day because she had tried to suppress her need to move her body. And as any of you who've got a child with ADHD will know, children with ADHD need to move, and they need to move in order to learn, and they need to move in order to focus and concentrate. But if you're in a, for example, an educational setting, or you're taking your child to somewhere where a lot of movement isn't really acceptable. You're taking your child to the cinema or the theatre or something, or to a restaurant or a cafe where excessive movement is going to be a little bit challenging in that setting. They might then, as a way of masking their need to move, try to suppress that need for physical activity, and that can be very, very difficult. But I think the main point here, everyone, and the really important point here, is that let's think about energy and cognitive, emotional, and physical energy when your child is in certain settings, and particularly at school. If a lot of their energy is going into how trying to hide features of myself, really fundamental features of myself and who I am. If all of the energy is going to there, the energy isn't going into, of course, learning effectively and cooperating and contributing effectively in that setting, and particularly in education. And when we understand the different ways that masking can present, then we also begin to understand the potential impact on the child in terms of their ability to progress at school. And not only that, but also the impact on the child's mental health and well-being. And I've put some points there on the slide that you can see for yourself what can result from this. And in extreme cases, it will take its toll on mental health over time. There can be a challenge, of course, in diagnosis. If the child is masking, is trying, to hide the features of their neurodiversity, it can be challenging for parents and carers and professionals to identify that, and is one of the reasons why we know that we have this later identification and diagnosis problem with girls and young women in particular. And I will often say in schools, for example, particularly with the girls, look beyond physical hyperactivity, look beyond challenging behavior. Let's look at her memory, look at her organization, look at her attention span, and look at, is she trying to mask some of these things, of course, in order to address that delay in diagnosis. And then I've heard 1,000 stories of parents saying, well, I've given the information in for the diagnosis. This is how my child is at home, where they are most loved and most comfortable. And then the school aren't backing me up because he or she is masking, and they're presenting differently in the school, for example. So it can take its toll, particularly on mental health and well-being, of course. So let's move on, everyone, in the last 15 minutes, and let's talk about what we can actually do. Okay, so how we can support children or young people who are masking. And I think that point there where it says celebrate ADHD and neurodiversity. And I think that is probably one of the most important points, and one of the most powerful strategies that you as parents and carers have got when you're working with your child, bringing your child up. If you know that there are issues around masking in different settings and different situations, then one of the best things that you can do is to constantly be looking to reinforce that message of you're okay. It's completely normal. Every human being has a neurocognitive profile. I've got one, you've got one, your child's got one. They're all different. Your brain is as unique as your fingerprint. No one's got your brain. And saying to your child, your profile just contains some elements of ADHD or a lot of ADHD or whatever it is, or maybe autism as well in there, maybe dyslexia, and that's just who you are, and it's completely normal and completely natural. One of the most important things that you can do as a parent or carer is just to love your child unconditionally and communicate to them that that they've just got a brain, and this is what their brain is like. We need to normalize. That's the word that I use a lot. Normalize the conversation around neurodiversity. And I talk a lot in schools around schools doing this as well. Schools having a profile for neurodiversity. I say, what displays do the children walk around? What do they walk past every day? What do they see every day? Do they see positive, strength-based messages around neurodiversity? Or do they see, examples of celebrities, famous people, successful people who are neurodiverse? Are these the messages that children are getting around neurodiversity? That it's not going to hold them back. It's not going to mean that they're not going to be successful in life. And it also means that schools making clear statements like the Witherslack group do, that you're welcome here and you are included here, and we understand and we get you and we're going to work with you. That's one of the most important things I think that we can do. But there's also around support. Now, it's interesting the way in which the conversation is changing in education, and also in places like workplaces. I do a lot of training for businesses and companies around neurodiversity at work. And it's interesting how the conversation is changing about support. And I often argue that, particularly in businesses and companies and schools, is that you have an offer for people. It's called reasonable adjustments. Under the law, the Equality Act, people at work, for example, with ADHD, are entitled to changes or adaptations to how they work, called reasonable adjustments, so that they can thrive in the workplace. And, in the past, what's happened is children have been in classrooms, people have been in the workplace, and then they've had problems have arisen, right? And then support is then offered. What I would argue for, and what I'm seeing increasingly around me, is the support is up front. And if there's any educational professionals with us today, I would encourage you to do this so that we are not waiting for children to come and tell us, because if they're masking, they're not going to tell us because they're masking, right? Or we're not waiting for children to be exposed by having difficulties and problems that we then have to manage. Instead of that, we put support, we are proactive with support. And I often use the example of, a teacher at the start of a lesson saying, right, the first part of this lesson is we're all going to read this text. Well, we're not all going to read it the same. Some of you will read it in pairs. Some of you will read it twice. Some of you will read it in the corner with a set of ear defenders on and a little screen around you. Some of you will read it with me. Some of you will read a bit and then stop and talk and then read another bit. Some of you won't read it at all. You'll have it read to you on a device. These are the supports that are on offer to everybody. Now, professional teachers, of course, be the gatekeeper of the support. They can decide what's appropriate or not. But if you're a parent or a carer, I would encourage you to think about this. If your child is masking with you, then they're not going to be proactive in coming forward. And we need to address that. So it's about when you are suggesting things to your child or you're doing homework with your child, for example, it's saying, well, these are some of the things that we could do. You don't have to tell me anything, right? In the workplace, people don't have to declare their diagnosis if they choose not to, right? Because the support is proactive and it's there and it's upfront around that. And I think that's really, really important, that we normalize the concept of support, but we also communicate with people. These are the supports that are on offer. And I often say, for example, to teachers, if you're doing this in a classroom, that child who's not opening her mouth, who is masking the fact that she's struggling, will watch you do that in a very normal, routine way, watch you do that with other children. That may be the case, that may be the thing that gets her to drop the mask and to say, look, I'm struggling as well, miss. Can I have that support as well as him, for example? Can be really, really important. Look at the column on the left, everyone. Mindfulness, self-regulation. I know some of you will be laughing at me now, saying you haven't met my son. You're talking about mindfulness or meditation or yoga. Yeah, I tried all of that and it didn't work for me. So it's not for everyone. But I think the point I'm making here is we know that one of the challenges for children and young people with ADHD is this physical and cognitive hyperactivity, that they are on the go all the, a lot of the time. I know some of you will be struggling with sleep with your kids with ADHD. That is very, very common. And when I was a teacher for 25 years, and I was teaching teenagers and I'm talking to them and they're saying I had 2 hours sleep last night, and there they were at 3 o'clock in the afternoon, still on the go. And so it's about, one of the really important points to make about masking, and I mentioned it before about rejection sensitivity, that we accept that there's a high level of anxiety that goes with this, to try to keep this up all day, right? The feelings, about I'm anxious that the mask won't drop, people won't find out who I really am, that's inevitably going to cause a degree of anxiety in any child or young person. And therefore, anything that you can do as a parent or carer, or indeed as an educational professional during the school day, anything that you can do that's about helping your child to self-calm and self-soothe. Have a look at emotion coaching or emotion naming strategies. You might want to have a Google of some of that. But just about, what are the routines in our house, particularly in the evening, where I help my child to self-calm. One of the very, very fundamental first steps is belly breathing, teaching your child to just breathe deeply from the belly, and just be conscious of their breathing, or grounding techniques where you say to your child, just focus on what is around you in this environment and tell me in detail exactly what it is that you can see. The objective of a strategy like that is that you're trying to distract essentially your child from all of that negative, repetitive thinking that goes with anxiety as a result of their masking, and you're trying to bring them back to the now and just get them to focus on something else. But also, and I run courses on mental health, one of the most important strategies is something called competencies and building competencies. If your child is masking in certain aspects of their life, and particularly school, then anything that you do that builds your child's competence in an area that they really love and enjoy. And, if your child's got an ADHD diagnosis, then you know very well what I'm about to say now, that ADHD is an interest and engagement driven neurocognitive profile. So what your child engages with and is interested in is really, really important. And we all know this when, we ask children with ADHD to do one thing and then there's no issue, they just do it. And then we 10 minutes later ask them to do something else, and it's really challenging. And you're thinking, well, 10 minutes ago you were great, so what's going on now, right? And it's understanding that interest and engagement is everything. Children with ADHD struggle to start things that they're not immediately interested in. So whatever your child is interested in, And with ADHD, this could chop and change, remember, quite different from autism. This might be, they might go through different things, right? Is for you, I think, as a parent or carer, to really do everything you can with the resources that you've got to encourage your child with that interest or that activity or that skill or whatever it is. Because the more competent we feel in some areas of our lives, then the more resilient we can be for the other areas of our life that we find more challenging. So building confidence is a way of managing overall anxiety, which could be being driven by their masking, for example. But I'm going to say one last thing, everyone. Um, um, in an age appropriate way, when you feel that this is appropriate with your child, is to have the conversation around masking. Teach your child what masking is. Ask them, encourage them to talk about, to recognize it in themselves. But I'll say one last thing about masking, which is when this colleague of mine started working with me about 18 months ago, this is the colleague who's got ADHD. AUDHD. I've learned so much from her around that dual diagnosis and how that impacts on people. And she said something to me that I haven't forgotten, because for years I've been going all over the UK and abroad saying masking's bad. We need to address masking. We need to stop masking. Why does any child have to mask anything? They've got nothing to be ashamed about, right? Right. And I do believe that. And I've said that to you here this morning, right? But she said to me, she said, I get that, Colin. All right, I agree with you, she said, but there were elements of masking, she said, for me that had a positive effect. She said there were parts of this that as a girl with ADHD and autism, my ability to mask in certain situations got me through this mainstream school. She said intact, right, with no significant impact, on her mental health and well-being. She got through school, she got the qualifications she needed. Now, I know that doesn't apply to everyone, sorry. And you might be thinking, well, my child's struggling with this much more than she obviously was. But I wanted to share that with you, that for her, this idea of passing and getting by and getting through it, which she was able to do because of her ability to mask, she says, looking back, right, has, she's defined it as a positive experience in her life. Okay, bottom right, everyone, if you're an educational professional, but I would flip this as well, is if you're a parent or carer, is to keep that conversation with the school going, right? If your child is very dysregulated when they come home from school, if they are overly physically hyperactive, then it's talking to the school. I was talking to a school in Liverpool recently that said with one little boy, he was, they get him to be really, really active in the 20 minutes before he goes home every afternoon, because his mum's got a number of younger children as well. She was a single parent, and she was saying, managing this explosion of physical hyperactivity when her son comes home was really, really difficult. And the school was saying, all right, then we'll help you, we'll support you, we'll burn off some of your son's energy before he goes home in the afternoon. Now, not every school is able to do that, of course, but it's keeping those conversations going. And it's maybe for you as a parent or carer is to be saying to the school, have you talked about masking? Do you understand masking? I think my child is masking. Can we have a conversation around this? Because I'm concerned about this, because of the presentations of what I'm seeing with my child when he or she comes home at the end of the day. So that was a whistle-stop tour, everyone, of masking. I hope that was okay for everybody. I hope you found something in there that was useful or interesting to you. If you want to get in touch, carry the conversation on, there's my email address. But what we're going to do now, everyone, is we're going to go back to Jodie, and Jodie is going to, if we've got any comments or any questions, questions that anyone would like to ask, now is your chance, everyone, to put it in the chat if you want, and Jodie will be able to see that. Okay, so now we're going to go back to Jodie and we're going to do a little bit of a 10-minute Q&A. Thanks very much, everyone. Hi, Jodie.
Oh, that was great, Colin. Thank you. We've had some really great feedback and we've had a lot of questions come through. So, our first question is, how do we get rejection sensitive disorder diagnosed, as no one seems to recognize this, but my child definitely has it? Do you have any advice?
Yeah, at the moment, it's not kind of officially recognised as a, diagnosable condition. There is a number of people. Sorry, have you got a name there, Jodie? Sorry, the name of the questioner?
Oh no, I don't. Sorry, Colin.
Okay, no worries. Rejection sensitivity, I would say probably about the last 5 to 10 years, it's slowly begun to be more recognized by people and more discussed, and a little bit researched, but not a great deal. And so it's not officially recognized as a kind of a diagnosable condition, but of course, many doctors recognize this, particularly those that specialize in neurodiversity. And so I think the situation that we're at is about recognition, is about talking about this, to the school, to the workplace, whatever it is, and saying, this is recognized by many people all over the world as a feature of neurodiversity. But at the moment, you're not able to get a formal diagnosis of rejection sensitive dysphoria. I think it's going to be interesting in the future because there is a lot of discussion at the moment around the diagnostic criteria for ADHD. If you've gone through this with yourself or your child, you'll know that when you read the diagnostic criteria for ADHD, it reads like little boys. All right, and so that needs to change, and that needs to recognize internalized hyperactivity and cognitive hyperactivity a lot more, which is often, not always, but often how girls and young women and adult women experience hyperactivity with ADHD. So I think if there is going to be any discussion or change to the diagnostic criteria, then rejection sensitivity needs to be part of that discussion as well. But I think at the moment, it's just about making people aware of this and drawing people's attention to it. Okay.
Oh, that was great, Colin. Thank you. Our next question is, how do I explain to a Senko that my child is masking when he acts or hides like a neurotypical child at school?
Yeah, this is the question, isn't it? What has got a name for the questioner there, Jodie?
Oh no, I don't. Sorry, Colin.
No,
There's
okay.
so many questions coming through. I'm trying to grab them
Right.
as fast
Okay.
as I can.
So whoever's asked this question, I really understand the position you're in, and I really understand the question. And I think that, it's about having that conversation, obviously, with the teacher and the Senko and saying, what is your child saying to you? How is it, why do you think your child is masking in school? What are you seeing at home, or what is your child saying to you at home that needs to be reported back? And I would ask, if you can, I don't know how old your child is, of course, but is asking, if you're having that conversation with your child, is asking them to give you some very specific examples that you can take to the teacher, and say, well, he was telling me about this lesson or this activity that you did, and he was feeling this and he did this, two quite different things. And asking the teacher then, by giving them specifics, you're giving that teacher something to kind of think about. Right then, so if the child acts like this, and if I'm seeing a pattern of behavior like this could be an indication that the child is masking in that situation. And I think it's about being very specific, and getting that information from your child to then relay back to the school, and to say, this is when he's presenting like this but what's underneath is this is how he's feeling because this is what he's told me. And also, maybe it's about if you think this is appropriate, and again, I don't know the age of your child, it's about maybe having the meeting with your child there. When you can say, when you as the parent are being the facilitator that's encouraging your child to talk about his or her feelings to the teacher and their struggles, and then discuss how they might be masking in the classroom. But because often our conversations around masking can be very general. Teachers meet Senkos instead of teachers, where the Senko doesn't know what the child's like on a daily basis or doesn't know what they're like in different activities, and it can all get very lost. Whereas I want to talk about specifics, specific activities, specific behaviors that could be an indication of masking. And you as a parent, knowing this, highlighting this in detail to the teacher involved. I hope that helps, and my best wishes to you who asked that question.
Oh, that was great, Colin. Thank you. Our next question is, with most research being on girls regarding masking, where is the best place to see the new research or any training on how it affects boys and men?
Great question. Well, the point I made was, of course, that there is very little out there specifically around boys and men masking. I mean, there's a bit of me that doesn't want to overplay this, because if you remember the slide that I presented around different ways that masking can present, I think a lot of those features will be the same for boys and men as well. I think there may be a huge crossover. When I run courses on this, and I'll say, why do you think women and girls with ADHD are underdiagnosed compared to boys and men? And you get responses back. People say, well, there are pressures on girls and women, certain pressures about being a certain way, acting a certain way, being more compliant in particularly school settings, maybe. Well, there's a lot of that could be said the same for boys and young men. There's a lot of compliant boys and young men in schools as well, and that pressure to get on and not get in trouble and all that just applies as equally to a lot, maybe not all, but to a lot of boys and young men in schools, just as much as it does to girls and young women. When I talked about the process of adolescence, and that self-consciousness and bonding and your primary influence becoming your peer group as opposed to your parents and carers, which we all recognize in adolescence. Well, exactly the same process is going on for young men, as is for young women during adolescence. So I think there might be a big crossover here. I think we do need to explore it, and it does need to be discussed and researched. But I'm conscious, let's not overplay it and say that, it will present very, very differently, masking in boys and girls, when I don't think it will. I think there will be that huge crossover. I hope that's helpful to the questioner. Thank you.
Yeah, that was great, Colin. Thank you. Our next question is, my 7-year-old son is diagnosed with ADHD and autism. Any little thing can irritate him or annoy him. He has started swearing and going mad at his brother and sister. He can get very violent. Do you have any advice on how I should react to this behaviour?
Okay, right. Well, thank you to that questioner. Well, first of all, I just want to say well done for having a 7-year-old with that dual diagnosis. I'm sure that there was a lot behind that. I'm sure that you pushed that and made that happen. So well done that he's got that diagnosis here. I'm sorry to hear that your son's having difficulties and challenges with emotional dysregulation at the moment, and also quite worrying that and he's hitting out in that sense as well. I mean, there's a couple of things that we need to think about, isn't there? Particularly around how does how does your son self-regulate and self-calm himself? He is only 7, so we are at the start of that journey. But what can you do if you go and Google, for example, strategies for parents around self-regulation, emotional self-regulation, self-calming, is trying out, as I mentioned before, some of those strategies with him, not in that moment or immediately after that moment, but in general, where there is a process of this where we're calming. It would also be looking for patterns. Looking for when these behaviours are more likely to happen. They could be, of course, a manifestation of some kind of stress or anxiety that your child is having. I don't know, obviously I'm guessing here, but, say things are happening at the end of the school day where he's, in this case, talking about masking. He's held it together all day and now he's hitting out. And he's doing that to his brother and sister, did you say, or his siblings? And so that could be an issue. It could be in relation to something very, very definite. I think any consequence, of course, you've got to stop that. You've got to protect, everyone else from his hitting out. So it's an immediate, constant, instant consequence that is time bound and that is very clear to him and is very consistent with this as well. And I think, in terms of the autistic elements to your son's profile, then it's about being that very, very clear, delineation of we don't do this, we do this, we don't do this, that kind of logical, literal understanding that might work with him. If we start to do it now, he is only 7, right? We start to do it now and then putting that consistently in place, that these are the guidelines in which we work, or the rules, if you want another word for it, that, we don't hit out and we don't do this, we don't do that. And there's a yes or no, there's a clear consequence to those kind of behaviors. But also is bearing in mind that, the emotional dysregulation in a 7-year-old, will have a reason somewhere. There's something there that he's not coping with. Very, very clear routines that we follow, very clear expectations, so that the autistic element to his profile, has that certainty and that predictability, and trying to minimize change or with forewarning of change, those strategies around getting him to be as comfortable as possible with, that certainty and structure and predictability in his life. The ADHD features to his profile, is he moving enough? Is he getting all of that physical hyperactivity? Has he got a channel for all of that? It can be a useful strategy as well to help with emotional dysregulation. But I understand, completely get how challenging that is, especially when there's other siblings in the picture, and especially when there's hitting out as well. So good luck with that. Thank you.
Oh, that was great, Colin.
Okay.
Thank you. We have time for one more question, and our last question is, my son is currently going through an ADHD referral at the moment through school. He's currently really struggling with his anxiety. For weeks, he has been crying and worrying that he doesn't want to grow up because he will eventually die. He is only 7. I got from him that this is because of the year 6 he's leaving and growing up. Is this a normal response from someone with ADHD to go through?
Great question. I think it's a normal response for any child. I did, oh God, it was a couple of years ago now. I did a session on bereavement and supporting children who've experienced bereavement. And I remember, if I could find those slides, I remember doing some research around this, around the point at which children learn about life and death, and manage, and there is a process of that, and it's completely natural, and all children go through it, and some children obviously can find this difficult, and it's that understanding, isn't it, about change. Sorry, Jodie, did you say going through an ADHD diagnosis?
Yes, they're going through a referral now.
For ADHD, right?
Yeah.
Because I was just thinking for autism might add something else to the picture there. I mean, what I would recommend to you is to talk to your child around change and how change is natural, and we all experience change. But it's also that discussion is just cushioning that, isn't it? With, I am here for you. I'm always going to protect you. I'm always going to be here, and I love you, and you're safe, and it's repeating those messages to him, all the time, that, you as his parents, you can come to and he can talk to you about this. But I do think there's an element that is just part of that natural kind of typical child development, is that realizing that, concepts like death, or also, things change, and that's part of life. And then it's about putting the positives of that. The year sixes are leaving, right? But they're going to a new school that is going to help them because they're older. And it's, putting it within a frame of safety and security and love, yeah, safety and security and love. I hope that helps with that question. Thank you.